Xi Jinping is an interesting political figure in that he has completed a number of anti-corruption campaigns since he rose to power in 2012 and 2013. And now you can say, he is the paramount leader in China. He is the president of the country, but his real power lies in the fact that he's general secretary of the CCP. So he just started his third term now. And he has really taken on an importance that is quite unlike what we've seen for many years, actually. So Deng Xiaoping was one of the proponents of this collective leadership, as it's called, in which the CCP Central Core, the Politburo Standing Committee in particular, has a much more consultative process within itself. Under Xi Jinping, we've seen a more assertive China, but we've also seen a more like re-centralization actually of power under Xi himself. So Xi now spearheads a lot of large projects. He spearheads quite a lot of, let's say, the charting of general policies, but he also the leading small groups that are in charge of different things. So he's actually quite influential as a person.
I just want to go to this, because Xi Jinping is such an important figure in international politics now,
right,
because of China's strength, economic capability, military capability. But in this, China's previous leaders have all been very influential on China. So you mentioned Deng Xiaoping, Mao Zedong. But I want you to just explain to our audience, as we look at figures from history like Deng Xiaoping and Mao Zedong, we see them as these larger-than-life, founding father figures of China. But explain to the audience briefly what Xi Jinping now represents, because if I'm not mistaken, Xi Jinping has now placed himself, or he has been placed in that echelon of the historic leaders of China, the people that are considered as central to the Chinese project, the Chinese Communist project. And Deng Xiaoping thought, and now we have Xi Jinping thought. So can you tell us a little bit, just briefly, on that?
Right. So going back to, Mao Zedong is perhaps the most well-known Chinese politician of all time. He's the one that most people recognize instantly. But after his death, Deng Xiaoping, so Mao Zedong was essentially, he was a proponent of taking Marxism-Leninism as its sort of the core ideology of the Communist Party, but then combining that with Chinese characteristics. So essentially suiting Marxism-Leninism to Chinese particularities and the Chinese society in general. And so this was introduced as a sort of core tenet from the sort of establishment of the Communist Party in 1921, and especially it took on prominence after 1949 when the People's Republic of China was established after the Civil War and all of these things happened. So Mao Zedong was perhaps the first person who took Marxism-Leninism and sort of shaped it into his own thing, because he felt that in China we just have certain societal features that make it impossible to directly adopt the Soviet model. So taken that, from that, Deng Xiaoping then went in a slightly more pragmatic direction. He essentially argued under him for a more pragmatic turn with what was termed socialism with Chinese characteristics. And so essentially this was about combining some market forces, allowing some market forces, because ultimately socialism would have to go through a little bit, the stages would be a little bit longer in China as opposed to other countries. Then after that, other leaders after him, so Jiang Zemin, for example, also with the 3% and all of these things, sort of doubled down on this, we'll let some capitalists actually into the communist power because they're still doing honest labor for the good of the socialist revolution and these things. And then now we've up to 2017 with the installment of Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era into the Chinese constitution. We've essentially seen both a doubling down on the fact that China is such a particular country, so you can't just make these measures straight. You have to adapt in certain steps and all of these things. But we've also seen under Xi then under Deng Xiaoping we had this responsive diplomacy, as it was called. So a much more wait and see. He had this very famous dictum of hide your strength and bide your time. So under Xi Jinping, we've seen a much more assertive China, but also China that essentially does something like it strives for achievement on the international stage. It strives to become more global. It strives to become more visible, and with that, also there's a growing sense under Xi's leadership, and this is what he represents. That China has now taken on sort of, it's, as I said, come back to the center of the world's political stage, but it's also taken on a role that is much more all-encompassing in the world political system than has previously been the case. So China now is charting out a lot of new routes and roads into the world. I mean, we saw this starting in the 1980s with the going global, all of these different strategies in which China wanted to integrate itself better into the world economic and financial system. But now we see this sort of to an even larger extent. I mean, 2013 with the Belt and Road Initiative obviously marked the start of this process, but in recent years, China has also started, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative, and these different things that are essentially heralding a new era in which China is trying to establish this shared future, like this community of shared destiny for all mankind. And this is essentially about allowing China to take its place as a sort of humane authority or benevolent ruler on the world stage, rivaling the US. So rivaling the US in terms of perhaps becoming the world's new hegemon, but also rivaling in terms of becoming an alternative governance pole, becoming an alternative norm shaper in the international system rather than just a norm taker. So we see essentially now China is going out. It's becoming more and more, let's say, ingrained and integrated within the world sphere. And so we call this phenomenon global China. So essentially China's glowing economic, financial, but also especially political footprint in the world. And this is what Xi Jinping very much represents for the Chinese people, this China that is sort of has risen up from 100 years of humiliation. All of these colonial, the colonial periods that have been taking place in China are now gone. It's all over, and China is sort of taking its rightful place in the world.
So it's a new, more confident, more international, a globally engaged China, essentially. Right. So before we go to the BRI and the global engagement, I just want to give people an idea, if you could help me. The Chinese economic miracle, as it's called, is nothing short of a miracle, is it not? Because the number of people that have been raised out of poverty from below the poverty line to essentially a middle class and a low middle class, it's numbers in the hundreds of millions. And just since our lifetimes, I mean, from the 80s, 90s to today, the image of China, the perceptions of China have completely changed. Now, for example, you mentioned the United States and the strategic threat of a hegemonic China, or the threat of being a multipolar world or a bipolar world. Okay, but the Americans have had deep interests in China leading up to the Chinese Communist Revolution with the Kuomintang. In fact, the previous regime in China before the communists took over escaped to Taiwan. And it's well known that if you want to read original Chinese literature, Chinese art, culture, before the Communist Revolution, you have to go to Taiwan. And now we see the chain, and if I use the word chain, so I'll remind our audience that American foreign policy has by design encircled China with military bases. So anyone can go and check Google. You can go just type American bases around China, and you'll see a quite clear encirclement. And that's not by accident, that's part of a design. It's called the First Island Chain. It's meant to be the first line of defense against a China that wants to launch attacks throughout the world. So this is sort of the framing of the issue that the West has sort of given us. So just touching on the Chinese story, could you tell us a little more about why they decided to go for the Belt and Road Initiative? And I mean, people view the Belt and Road Initiative as purely transactional, right? It's about, you give us some money and we'll develop a port, and then it helps your trade, and it's a very clear sort of a circle of things that are happening. But now we think there might be more to that with these conversations around debt trap diplomacy. So before we come to debt trap diplomacy, just talk to us about the introductions of the Belt and Road Initiative and what it's all about.
Right. So, I mean, in short, China's economic transformation started in the 1980s in true. Like that was when it like truly started to take place after Deng Xiaoping took over power. And as I said before, Deng was a much more pragmatic leader. So he truly believed in actually taking some market forces and having them sort of develop the economy in a much more in a much more like a flexible manner, really. So this is when it all started. We call this the opening up and reform era because this was really when China opened up to the outside world. This is when China became more integrated, but also when a number of reforms were introduced in China that actually managed or they allowed for certain sectors to really grow exponentially. And special economic zones were a big part of this, of course. So this is also why we see now, even today, China uses decentralized models, experimental models, when it comes to building up, let's say, economic infrastructures. China's also doing this in the BRI today, but I can get back to that. But even back then, Shekou and Shenzhen is perhaps one of the best examples of China's economic transformation, because what started out as a tiny, sleepy fishing village really grew very, very quickly through the joint efforts of the government and the local officials there that started to do experimental policymaking practices that would allow the special economic zone to flourish, and essentially infrastructure was constructed in incremental steps to make sure that the process was facilitated in the best way possible. Now, why I'm saying all of this is because this is exactly what China is still doing with the BRI. China Merchants Port Shekou was the first actually to implement this very experimental model when it comes to this specific port design. And this was what made Shenzhen grew exponentially. China essentially took this model, put it back into national practice, and then exported it from Shekou to other ports in China. And now China has, had some trial and error, I would say. In China we have this saying of crossing the river by feeling the stones. And this is exactly what this model is all about. It's about going, as I said, in an incremental and flexible manner and making sure that you actually step by step build up the different capacities, and you do this in a way that mitigates any risk, that mitigates any problematic issues that can arise with governance practices and all of these things. And that's just to say this was the sort of, let's say, very small start of what we can now see in the Belt and Road. China Merchants Port, as I said, is still one of the biggest exporters of the Belt and Road initiative globally, and of course, since I focus on the 21st century maritime Silk Road, which is part of the Belt and Road initiative in itself. This is still very much used today. This is a model in which China, as I said, they export the so-called Shekou Moshui, so the Shekou model, or the PPC, the Port Park City model, to different countries, and then they essentially make sure that the creation of the special economic zones, the creation of infrastructure, industry, and all of these related things links up with the hinterland, links up in a conducive manner to make sure that it becomes a financial hub, transshipment hub, and all of these things. And that's just to say that all of China's economic miracle, all of these things that had happened in China, the building up of massive infrastructure, like the road net, the internet when that started. All of these things we've seen in China when it comes to these massive drives of building up, and also the expansion of the capacity of different sectors, is essentially what led to the Belt and Road Initiative being designed from top Chinese policymakers, including Xi Jinping.